In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's nitrogen. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This does deliver the sheen that it's known for. The red sheen is often so strong that it can make this appear kind of purple, especially with changing light. It's a very cool effect, really. Like many super sheening inks, though, there does create an issue with smearing long after it should be dried. And while I did enjoy using this ink, I see if I had a bottle of it, it being kind of a chore to use it up. So it's a very cool ink. I'm just not sure that it's for me. Now, I didn't try this, but I did hear that to control the sheen, in order to be able to control some of the drying, that you can water it down. So I am interested in knowing how that works if people have tried it. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a D-like Alpha with a Fude type nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. The medium nib gives us mostly a blue tone. Now, it's a dark blue, and combined with the sheen, it makes for a very interesting color. Definitely works well in a professional environment. I get no feather. I get no spread. I do get sheen in the areas where it's darker. Not a ton of shading, but it definitely does sheen in what would be those shading areas. The broad nib is much darker than we got with the medium. And with it being much darker and wetter, we get a lot more sheen. Now, we get no feather, we get no spread. The shading is there, but again, it's shading with the sheen. So we're not really getting darker tones so much as where there would be shade, there is sheen, and there is a lot of it. Looking at the stub nib, you see that there's going to be that spot at the top where something happened and it put a blob of ink down. I think that was the pen and not the ink. Now, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get shading, but the shading shows itself in the form of sheen. It's very nice here, and the biggest issue I run into is the idea that this blue could look kind of purple. At the back of the page, we see that there is a spot where it looks like it started to come through where the pen burnt. Not that it's any kind of a real issue. Other than that, we get a very light ghosting, which is rare for this paper, and no bleed. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with A Kaweco Sport with a medium nib. A Kaweco Sport with a broad nib. A Kaweco Sport with a 1.5 stub. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, it's much lighter, much more blue a tone than we had on the Clairfontaine, and that's because of the absorbency of this paper. Now, we're not getting any kind of feathering. Let me take that back. We are getting little bits of feathering. They're very small, very manageable here. No spread. We do get a couple moments of shading, but again, that's really getting eaten up. The sheen that came through in the Clairfontaine is noticeably missing here. Looking at the broad nib, we get feather, a lot of it, all over the place. This is not a good combination here. We're also seeing a bit of spread. We don't get the shading, we don't get the sheen that we had in the Clairfontaine. It really doesn't look good here. This is not a good combination. Looking at the stub nib, we see that it is quite a bit lighter than we had with the broad, even a little bit lighter than we had with the medium. Now, we do get a tiny bit of feathering. I think it's kind of manageable here, but it is here, and in moments like on the word short, it can be a bit distracting. Short is that third line right in the middle at the line down the center. We have no shading, and we have none of the sheen that this ink is known for. Looking at the back of the page, you see that this ink really is very aggressive on this paper. There is a lot of it coming very much through, especially on that broad, which is a bit wetter. It did not touch the page underneath, though, which shows some strength for this paper. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we get very minor feathering, really incredibly minor, but it is there. I think a finer nib would probably have done a bit better. We're not getting any kind of real spread. We don't get any kind of shading, and it is a dark blue that we're getting on the page. Definitely blue. We're not seeing any of the sheen coming through. The property of the paper is completely eating that up. Looking at the broad nib, it feathers like a feather monster. It absolutely does. It does spread. It's quite a bit darker than we had with the medium. I do think that it almost passes as a dark blue, maybe even a blue-black in this case. Tone of the paper is probably having some of the effect there. Not a bad-looking color, just a bad performance. The sheen, as we would expect with this paper, is not coming through, so we're not getting it. Looking at the stub nib, we see that we've got a much lighter tone than we had with the broad, even lighter than we had with the medium. Now, the feathering is much less than we had with the broad, about the same that we had with the medium. The spread would be hard to tell because it is a stub, so I'm going to go ahead and say it's not spreading, just to be nice to this ink. It's not shading, and we're not seeing the sheen the ink is known for. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we have a ton of ghosting. I don't know that you could use the back of this page, but none of this came through and touched the page underneath. The other page is absolutely clean, which does make this a good ink for on the paper, as long as we can control some of the feathering. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a national Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we get no feather. We get no spread. Now, we're not getting any shading. We're not getting the sheen. This paper has continuously surprised me. And I think as this channel evolves down the line, this might become a standard paper because it's rather affordable. Looking at the broad nib, we see it's quite a bit darker than we had with the medium. We get a tiniest bit of feathering only in a couple of areas. You really have to look for it. Like in the word 20 at the TY, you see a little bit. Not bad. Really no spread. We have no shading. The sheen doesn't come through. The absorbent paper is absolutely using it up. But this is a pretty good match. Looking at the stub nib, we see that it is lighter than the broad, but definitely darker than we had with the medium. Now, we're really not getting any kind of feathering. We're not getting any spread. You do see a couple smudge marks that happened on the word his, second line. That's a result of the sheening compound of this ink that it does like to smudge quite a bit later because I didn't smudge it while I was writing. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it does ghost. The ghosting is pretty under control. I think you could use the back of the page if you wanted to. It absolutely does not bleed through. It doesn't come anywhere near touching the next page. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman's number 9. Here is Camlin Royal Blue. Here is Diatramentis Document Blue. Here is Diamine Indigo. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the medium nib, we see a very nice dark blue going on here. It's looking especially nice on this paper. I think the tone of the paper is really helping the color of this ink even more. We're not getting any kind of feathering, which I was a bit surprised. We're not really seeing any spread. We're not getting any of the shading and not the sheen. And I know in the beginning I said the sheen is definitely there for this ink, but we're mostly using lower quality production paper. Looking at the broad nib, we see there is tiny bits of feathers, just to say, honestly, they are there, although they are not an issue of themselves. I don't see it being something that would stop someone from using this paper. It's not spreading, it's not shading, it's not sheening, but it is performing well. Looking at the stub nib, we see that it is just a tad bit lighter than we got with the broad. even a little bit lighter than we got with the medium, and it's weird, but it's a very definite blue, not dark blue. It looks much more lively as a tone here. Now we have no feathering, surprising. We have no spread. We have no shading. The sheen, it doesn't come through. It just can't fight through this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see that, yes, it is ghosting rather heavily, but this is a very dark ink. I think with another ink, this, or with depending on the color you put on the back, I think you could use the back of this page. I don't see this as making it unusable. I think this is very good in what's going on. And it does not bleed through. It is not touching the page underneath, so kudos. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Sailor, their Gentle Four Seasons Sakura Mori. Here is an orange ink by Pen BBS, their 138 Spessartine. Here is a magenta ink by Krishna, their brown pink. Here is a yellow ink by Pilot, their mixable yellow. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the medium nib, we see that it is a rather bright blue compared to most of what we've seen, except that stub on the last writing sample. We do get a tiny bit of feathering, but actually the feathering is way under control here, doing especially good. It does have a tiny bit of spread, but only because I'm very familiar with this pen. Now, it's not shading and it's not giving the sheen, but none of those are expected here. Looking at the broad nib, it does feather, it does spread, but both the feathering and the spread, while they're present, are completely manageable, especially given this paper. Only in a couple spots does it appear to be a little problematic. As a tone, it's much darker than we had with the medium. It's not giving us the shading, which we would not expect, and the sheen that the ink is known for is dead to this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit lighter than the broad, just a little bit darker than the medium. It does have a couple tiny moments of feathering that go on, but really, again, I see it as manageable given the paper. It's not really spreading, but that's because I don't tend to go looking for spread with the stub nibs. It's not shading, which we don't expect to happen on this paper. It's not sheening, which we don't expect on this paper. Looking at the next page, you'll see there's a bunch of dots where I circled because it did come through and touch the back of the page. There is a lot of bleeding, and you can see it when you see the back side. Not unexpected for the paper. The amount of ghosting that's going on, absolutely not a problem. You might need an undersheet here to protect the next page. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? When it comes to really being able to choose the pen for this, if you like sheen, any wet pen will do, any nib size. It's really dealer's choice, and you get to enjoy the crap out of it. Now, if not, I mentioned it in the very beginning, I haven't tried it, but I've heard that you can water the ink down and it will help control some of that sheen, controlling some of the smearing later. And then I would suggest going with a drier fine or medium nib in order to enjoy its color more. Even though it smears, I do have to say that that purple tone that you get is kind of cool. I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.